So today we're going to continue with our negative space painting. If you use the plastic wrap on your painting, you should be able to peel that off and see the interesting textures. If you used any of the salt, really gently brush that off of the surface of your painting. That way you get a nice smooth surface to work with for today. Now you should have your templates that you've made. Here I've got 3 different examples, but for this particular teacher example, I'm going to use just the butterflies. And what we're going to do is create a tracing to make a first layer of our shapes. So I want you to create 3 to 5 of your shapes spread out across your painting, and you're just going to very carefully trace that shape with a pencil. Now you may choose to have some of your shapes go outside of your 8x10 border, like that first example that I just created did, and you may have some other ones that fit within the border, and you get to choose the placement with what you think is going to visually look good and make sense based on the shapes that you have chosen. But for this first layer, you want to create 3 to 5 tracings, and you don't want these to overlap. You want them to be spread out across different parts of your painting. And once you have your first layer of shapes traced, you can set your templates off to the side and get your watercolor paints out ready to use. And you are going to be painting around each one of your shapes that you've just traced and mixing a darker version of your same analogous colors from before. And as you're painting around each one of your objects with that darker layer of color, you want to be very, very careful. And another great trick that I can share with you is if you have a large area that you're trying to paint, sometimes you can have a hard edge to your painting. And if you don't want that to dry that way where it's really visible, take just a wet brush and paint along that edge. And what that will do is let the colors bleed a little bit to give you a soft edge. And that's going to help prevent your paint from drying before you can get back to that section to paint and blend those colors together. It'll just help it fade and feel like it's a more smooth color transition as you're painting. Another really important trick that I want to share with you is whatever section of your painting you're working on, you want to make sure you're mixing the same colors that are on the layer beneath it. So in my example, that upper area tends to be more blue-green and blues, so I want to make sure that I'm mixing that same color. That's going to help all of my colors stay really rich and vibrant and consistent throughout the painting as I'm adding these layers of glazed colors on top. Because watercolor is transparent, if you put one color on top of another layer of a dried color, if they're different, they're going to sort of visually mix together and they won't be as vibrant or pure. So in my painting, where I see violets, I want to paint more violets on top. Where I see blues, I want to paint more blues on top. And keep those colors fairly consistent. And you just want to very carefully work your way through each section of your painting, paying very close attention to where your shapes are and making sure you paint right up to those shapes, and that it has enough contrast that your color's dark enough to make your shapes show up. And now once it's finished, you want to let it completely dry. You can even use a hair dryer if you want to speed up this drying process before we move on to the next step. Once your painting is completely dry, you can get your templates back out, and we're going to create another layer that underlaps below or sort of behind those first layers of shapes that you have created. You can also experiment with flipping your templates over and tracing from the opposite side. If you have asymmetrical shapes, this will give your drawing or your painting more variety. So as I'm tracing my templates here, I end up making a lot more of my shapes because you want to fill up the space really well. And you do want to find some interesting places and some interesting arrangements where one shape underlaps another one. So if I want it to lay there, I'm going to trace around it, but not trace the part of that butterfly where it goes over top of that first one. I'm going to leave that part out. That way it looks like it goes behind. Remember, have some of your shapes go off of the page, go out beyond the edges, and you want to fill up the whole space this time, making sure you don't have any large areas that don't have a shape in them. And once you have all of your shapes complete, you're going to go back to your watercolors and mix a thicker, darker version, this time using less water and more paints to make sure your paint is dark enough to have contrast. And you are going to paint your third layer of color, this time around your new shapes, plus the shapes from the first layer. So all around the negative space of any of your shapes that you have. This is going to take a lot of concentration and a lot of focus because it's very easy to accidentally paint over an area that you did not mean to paint into. And while you're working, you should be able to see an instant value contrast between the first layer, the second layer, and the newest third layer. You want them to read as light, medium, and dark. It's very important that you have enough contrast in order for your shapes to show up. Now, another thing that you can do is if you like the effect of the salt, as you complete one like little section, you can add a few grains of salt to that area once it's finished being painted, and that will continue adding in some of those textures to your painting. Another big challenge in working with this painting is making sure that you don't rest your hand in wet paint and then accidentally smear it. So this takes a lot of concentration and a lot of focus. You have to be really aware of what part of your paper is wet and what part of your paper is dry as you're working. So be sure that you really take your time with this painting and make sure that you're painting neatly and carefully and making sure that you have clean edges, that you're painting right up to the edges of your shapes. This is going to make your painting have good craftsmanship and be visible and understandable to your viewer. This assignment is really all about giving you the practice in order for you to hone your artistic skills. These are really simple, basic skills that any artist has to learn, and you really learn by doing. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with this. We're learning to make very simple washes of color. We're learning how to paint wet into wet where colors bleed and mix together. We're learning how to get really nice hard edges where we paint right up to the shape that we're creating. We're learning how to create different values with light, medium, and dark values in watercolor. We're learning how to paint with glazes where one color lays transparently over top of another one, and we're creating some really interesting textures using salt and plastic wrap. All of these techniques are very important, and you can apply them to more complex paintings in the future. And once you finish this layer today, we're going to leave it overnight to completely dry. Tomorrow we'll be cutting it out, adding our artist signature, and turning it in for grading.